Hi everyone, welcome to Module 7. During this module, we will be discussing high incidence disabilities. Our goals for this module are to do a quick review of Module 6, to go through high incidence disabilities, and then we'll have a wrap up with any upcoming assignments and reminders. So as you may recall from the last module, we talked about the IDEA recognized categories of low incidence disabilities. So take a moment to kind of think about which disability categories are considered to be low incidence disabilities. See if you can come up with a few. And hopefully you came up with these categories. So autism, deafblindness, developmental delay, hearing impairment, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairment are all characterized as low incidence disabilities. And this week, we're going to move into a discussion of the high incidence disabilities. This is particularly important for general education teachers because given the name, you might suspect that you will see greater prevalence of the disabilities that are included in this module, and you're much more likely to serve students with high incidence disabilities in the general education classroom. Okay, so there are four categories that are characterized as high incidence disabilities. The first is speech language impairment. The second is specific learning disability. The third category is serious emotional disability, or SED. We also used to refer to this as emotional behavioral disorder. So you might see EBD, or you might hear me refer to it as EBD. It's really hard to get my brain to switch to SED, but those are the same thing. And then finally, mild intellectual disability. So the acronym for mild intellectual disability is IDMI, which means intellectual disability mild. So 80% of students with disabilities have high incidence disabilities. So the large majority of those students that we serve who have IEPs or who are receiving services under IDEA, the greatest majority of them are students in these categories. And then the other 20% of the students who have disabilities that are served in public schools in the United States fall into those low incidence categories that we discussed in the previous module. So hopefully this gives you a picture of the extent to which we are meeting the needs of students with disabilities like learning disabilities or mild intellectual disabilities versus those that we are serving who have disabilities such as severe intellectual disability or other health impairments or traumatic brain injuries. The numbers of those students are much smaller than those of students with high incidence disabilities. So we'll walk through each one of these. And I kind of just talked through some of this, but the implications for you are that you're serving a large majority of students who have specific learning disabilities, which you will maybe notice on this slide is bolded for a reason. And that's because of these four categories, learning disability is the largest, we serve the largest number of students with learning disabilities. So of the disability categories, students with learning disabilities comprise the largest majority, and then followed by those with speech and language impairments. And you'll see here in the green that this is an old graph, and so they still use the term mental retardation. We do not use that language anymore. It's referred to as intellectual disability. But this kind of gives you an idea of some of the numbers. Also, again, this was from 2006, so the numbers are not as accurate as they should be. I actually should have updated this chart, especially for autism, because those numbers have grown drastically. But specific learning disability still comprises the largest, what word am I looking for? Sorry, guys, having a little brain freeze there. They still comprise the largest population within the within the high incidence disabilities. All right. Hopefully you got that. Sorry for that confusion. So the big picture here, why is it important for you? Because you are more likely than not to serve students who have high incidence disabilities in your general education classrooms. Okay? So speech and language impairments. Students who have speech and language impairments might have problems or need support with articulation. Sometimes they struggle with the fluency, and then oftentimes just with being able to produce vocalization. So trouble with their voice more generally. Um, Related to that also is the language. So part of it is like the actual structure and being able to speak. And then the other piece of it is being able to express language. So part of that can include expressive language, so talking and communicating with other people, and then receptive language, understanding and comprehending the language of others. So, what is the impact of speech language impairments? Part of that can relate to children's social development. It can impede or slow down the social development. It also has an impact on their comprehension. So, if you struggle with receptive language, then there's a great chance that your students might also struggle with comprehending or with acquiring the content, understanding the content that you're presenting to them. And then sometimes the speech and language impairments also cause some difficulty with students' ability to problem solve. So there are a number of implications for which you should be aware related to students who have speech and language impairments. So how can you support them? One of the most important things to do is just to provide a positive environment to make sure the students know that you're there to support them, that you provide extra time as needed, that you're patient. That's one of the biggest things that can be very frustrating for students who have speech and language needs, because they often kind of know what they want to say, but it's hard for them to express it. So just giving them a little extra time and being patient is very, very helpful. You can also try to teach your students listening skills, teach them how to maximize their time and use the tools that are available around them. You can provide them with visuals. These can help them to kind of identify other ways to communicate or to use them as tools to communicate. It sometimes helps trigger students' use of language. So you can think of visual supports that might be available. You can model the language that they need to use, and then provide opportunities for meaningful practice. And finally, if it's necessary, you can provide alternative assignments for students who are struggling more so than others. Okay, so these are a few strategies that you can use to support students who have speech and language impairments. So let's pause and practice here. Take a moment to read these questions and then think about how you might use visual supports to support the needs of students in your classrooms who have speech and language impairments. So feel free to research what those might be and then kind of take a moment to jot down some ideas, and hopefully you can really use some of these ideas in your current placements or in your classrooms if you're already a classroom teacher. Okay? When you finish with that activity, we'll move along. Actually, we'll move along to a break. And I don't remember if I mentioned this at the beginning of this lecture, but this one is actually a pretty short lecture this week because there are much fewer disability categories. So we'll be, a pretty short lecture. And after your break, come back and we'll wrap it up. So I mentioned that specific learning disabilities comprise the largest proportion of the high incidence disability category. And so what are specific learning disabilities? These are students who have normal intelligence typically, and they have a comparative gap in their processing in one or more areas. So these areas might include basic reading skills or fluency skills. It could be related to reading comprehension, or students who struggle with written expression. It could be related to mathematics calculation or problem solving, or listening comprehension and oral expression. So when you think of specific learning disabilities, you can think of things like dyslexia or dyscalculia. Those are kind of the primary cornerstone sorts of learning disabilities. But many students are so if you know someone who has dyslexia, if they receive special education services, they will be receiving that service under the category of specific learning disability. Dyslexia is a disability within that category. It's not its own disability, if that makes sense. We will talk more about ADHD. I think we talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the semester when I first introduced the categories. In most cases, students who have ADHD are served under under the other health impairment category, but many of the needs of students with ADHD are very similar to those with specific learning disabilities, but it's not always been recognized as a learning disability, and so this is something that is changing, but many students who have ADHD have many of the same needs and areas of support. So there are about 50% of students receiving, 50% of the students who are receiving special education services have specific learning disabilities. And similar to those who have autism, boys substantially outnumber the number of girls who have specific learning disabilities. And this, again, as I mentioned earlier, is the largest category of special education. So more than autism, more than traumatic brain injury, more than other health impairment, more than speech and language delay, students with specific learning disability comprise the largest category within special education. Okay, this was actually where I was supposed to take a break. I don't know what I did there. So you can take another break if you need to. I know those are very close together. I just screwed up on that. So sorry about that. But obviously, feel free to take another break and then we'll keep moving. So here is a video that gives you a look at some supports that you could embed in your classroom for students who have dyslexia. This is, I forget which country it's from. It's a video from abroad, but they actually talk about some really great strategies that teachers can use to support students with dyslexia. So things like even changing the color of the paper that you use to help them focus. So really, kind of simple tips and techniques, but they can make a major impact or have a major impact on your learners. So take a look at this video and then move along. So some important notes related to evaluation. One of the things that is important to note here is that in terms of student and teacher evaluation, there's a lot of responsibility on the general education teacher. So there's a link to a policy that's effective and that will be effective in 2020. And it points out things that will change as it's related to specific learning disabilities and how students will qualify. And so students who are categorized as the one who has a specific learning disability, it has to not be due to any other disability. They have to be assessed and not receive that diagnosis based on cultural factors or excessive absences, and it can't be due to a lack of appropriate instruction. So these strategies or, new sorts of policies are an effort to reduce the number of students who are being diagnosed or categorized as SLD and to avoid the over sort of identification of students who may not in fact have specific learning disabilities. So take a look at this information and it'll be becoming effective in 2020 in North Carolina. So what can you do to support students with SLD? You can write down steps. Okay, you can chunk their work or chunk their worksheets or activities into smaller sections. You can provide graphic organizers. Many students who have specific learning disabilities struggle with what we call executive functioning. So things like organization and keeping up with their supplies, pencils, and knowing how to keep things organized. So providing ways to help them organize their work and to break things down into achievable steps is really ideal. For students who struggle with math, maybe providing some manipulatives. You can also even have them type or dictate to scribe if they struggle with writing. And you really want to capitalize on your students' strengths. So find out what their strengths and their interests are and try to embed those in the activities that you are doing. So, for example, if you have a student who is really into Harry Potter, you can think of a way to embed the Harry Potter interest in their word problems or in their bubble map, or even in using it as a reinforcement. I know many of you are going to be in middle grades or high school teachers, and so you probably think reinforcement is just for younger kids, like the idea that, oh, if you do this, you get a sticker. Reinforcement works for everyone. I always like to use the analogy that we all go to work and we get a paycheck, right? So you get paid for doing your work, and that is a type of reinforcement. So even students in middle and high school still value and benefit from the use of positive reinforcement. So think of things that are age appropriate and useful and engaging for your student, but always do try to reinforce their, following the steps or engaging in procedures or, whatever it is that you're hoping for them to do. And think about ways to reinforce that by using their areas of interest. So it could be earning a movie on Fridays. It could be, choosing something out of a gift basket, whatever your many of you probably already have classroom reward systems. But in some cases, students with disabilities need a bit more reinforcement so that they learn how to, use these strategies independently. So think about ways that you might reinforce your learners in your classroom. These are some other strategies that you can do to support students who have learning disabilities. So I will let you read through each of those. I won't read through those because they're here on the screen, so you can read through those. And then other ways, again, to monitor student learning, to think about how to support students both with their writing and in other areas. Another category of high incidence disabilities is serious emotional disturbance. So again, students who have SED or EBD typically have average intelligence, but their achievement is impacted by their behavior. And so a lot of times people assume that students who have behavioral disorders are low achievers or have low IQs. But in fact, that's often not the case. It's just that their behavior becomes such a barrier for their ability to access the curriculum that they need that they're often not able to master the content and thereby not able to demonstrate their knowledge of the content. So students who have SED often have acting out sorts of behaviors or poor social skills. So when you think of students with SED, these are the students who will curse out the teacher in the middle of the classroom or slam books or maybe go to sleep. And these are students who also suffer from internalizing behaviors such as anxiety or depression. So they can be externalizing, right? That sort of tantrum sorts of behaviors, or they can be internalizing or withdrawing sorts of issues related to anxiety and depression. So when you think about some serious emotional disturbance, we're talking about issues like oppositional defiant disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, mood dysregulation disorder, bipolar disorder, and conduct disorder. So those are the subcategories within the category of serious emotional disturbance. And we think you've probably seen the quote unquote behavior classrooms. This is where we serve the needs of students with behavioral disorders, but also many times you will have students in the general education classroom who have anxiety and depression. That's not uncommon at all. So you want to be sure to be aware of what these conditions are and then how to support students. So a few important issues to recognize here is that some teams will identify other health impairment rather than serious emotional disorder. So you want to make sure you read your forms carefully and just have a clear understanding. If your student in fact has a serious emotional disorder, you want to make sure you understand what it is and how to best support them. Another thing to note is that about 50% of the students who have serious emotional disorders or disabilities also have a learning disability. And so sometimes their behavior can mask that learning problem. In North Carolina, specifically, you can't have a diagnosis of a learning disability if you have a serious emotional disability. And similarly, you can't have an autism diagnosis if you have a serious emotional disability. So it's just kind of some of those specific rules about the categories and diagnoses that are probably not of significant importance to you, but something good to know. And then our next category within high incidence disabilities is mild intellectual disability. And so these students often have below average intelligence, but they're still able to access the general education curriculum. In other words, you will likely still be serving students in your classrooms who have mild intellectual disability. So that means that they have IQs between 50 and 70. And it's often measured by cognitive abilities and adaptive behaviors. So not just by like an IQ test, but also by measuring their ability to engage in adaptive things like tying their shoes or following directions, throwing away their lunch, etc. This category reflects the fit between capabilities and the structure or the expectations of the environment. So can you do what is expected? And do you understand what is expected? There are 5 assumptions of students who have mild intellectual disability. The first is that their limitations are considered within the context of the environment. So within this particular space, are you able to achieve these goals? And you can't assume that because a student may struggle with a particular task in one space, that will transfer or translate to another space. So it has to be considered within the context of their environment. Secondly, the assessment considers cultural and linguistic diversity. In the past, there have been litigation and lawsuits related to the assessment of students with intellectual disability and the overdiagnosis of children, particularly African American boys with intellectual disability. And so more recently, efforts have been made to be more culturally responsive in how we measure and assess students with generally, and then more specifically to reduce the over-identification of intellectual disability. Another assumption is that students have both limitations and strengths, and so we have to think about what those are and how to use one to support the other. We also use a profile of needed supports. So what do students need to best succeed in a particular environment? And then finally, we know that with supports, life functioning for students with mild intellectual disability can greatly improve. So it's just really important to find what you need and then to embed or implement those supports to help your students succeed. So students with specific learning disabilities, mild intellectual disability, and emotional disabilities or serious emotional disorders can all benefit from many of the same instructional practices. So you can do things like, again, creating that positive environment, setting clear rules and routines and expectations, using things like visual supports and schedules to help students have an understanding of that routine and have reminders. You can engage in positive reinforcement, like I mentioned earlier, and you can teach social skills. So how do I engage in appropriate communication? How do I talk to my teacher? How do I talk to my peers? How do I let someone know that I don't feel like talking today? One thing I didn't mention when we were talking about the students who have serious emotional disabilities is that many of them will likely be working with a social worker, and they are much more prepared to kind of support those students who struggle with emotional disorders. And I know it can be a little more overwhelming, and perhaps you are apprehensive about supporting students who might have, disorders such as bipolar, right? But you really want to communicate with the other professionals with whom you work and talk to them about how you can support your students in the classroom and how you might be able to carry over any of the activities that they are working on with the psychologist or with the counselor or the social worker, okay? Students can also engage in self-monitoring. This is particularly important and helpful for older students who, have a good understanding of what their expected behavior is, and then whether or not they actually met that expected behavior, right? It helps to teach them self-awareness and to practice control. And typically students are pretty honest. Like, they know that if they had a rough day and they cursed you out and they threw chairs, they will typically not say like, yeah, I had a good day, when that is in fact not true. And so you can use this not only to teach them self-awareness, but as a way to collect data on their behavior and as a way to provide reinforcement. So you might collect their sheets over the week, and then if there are a certain number of yeses and then they have a specific goal, then they can earn a particular reinforcement. So self-monitoring is a great tool for students with particularly with emotional disorders, but most students who have any learning disability could benefit from the use of a self-monitoring worksheet. So this week for your reflection, I actually would love for you to do this simulation activity, and it's on the IRIS website, but I have included a link here where you can access the PDF, and I also have a copy of the PDF on our Moodle site. And so it will give you the website, and it'll provide you with directions to go complete the simulation activity. And the idea here is to give you an opportunity to see what it's like to, be a student with a learning disability or with ADHD. Oftentimes students who have these disabilities are really misunderstood. And so this website helps you to kind of understand some of the areas in which students with learning disabilities or ADHD struggle. And then it will ask you to complete a few questions. So the questions that are a part of the worksheet, I would actually like for you to submit those as your reflection this week. And so I have included those questions in your reflection prompt. And so just proceed as usual with your reflection, but make sure that you complete this activity because you need to complete it in order to get your reflection points. Okay? If you have any questions about this, please feel free to send me an email.